Lap 46. 6 laps to go. One chicane. One decision that had already been made hours before anyone reached that corner. The two McLarens arrived at the chicane after the 130R curve side by side, moving at roughly 220 kilometers per hour. Ayrton Senna had his front wheels alongside Alain Prost's cockpit. For a fraction of a second, there was a gap. A real gap. The kind of gap that Senna had been trained since childhood to see and attack without hesitation. He went for it, and Prost turned in. Not late, not accidentally. He turned in exactly when he had said he would, in exactly the way he had planned, in front of exactly the witnesses he needed to have present to make it all work. Both cars slid into the escape road. Engines dead. Wheels locked together. And in the silence that followed, before the crowd noise, before the radio transmissions, before the stewards and the lawyers and the headlines, Alain Prost unclipped his belts, climbed out of the car, looked at his watch, and walked away. He already knew he was world champion. The question was never whether he was going to win that day. The question was always what he was willing to do to make sure no one else did either. And that question had been answered the night before, in a conversation that almost no one heard. If you want to understand how Formula One championships are really won, stay with this story. Because what Prost told his engineer that night did not just change the outcome of 1989. It changed the unwritten rules of the sport forever. To understand what happened at Suzuka on the 22nd of October, 1989, you need to go back to May of that same year, to the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola, to a conversation between two teammates that was supposed to stay private, and instead became the first visible crack in a partnership that would end in wreckage. Before the race at Imola, Senna and Prost had made an agreement. Whoever led into the first corner from pole position would not be challenged through that opening sequence of turns. It was a gentleman's deal of the kind that existed in Formula One in those years, informal and unwritten, but understood by both parties. Senna had pole. He led into the first corner, but his car stalled at the start, and he had to restart from the back of the field. Prost won the race. When Senna caught up with the points, the question became whether the agreement applied to the restart. Senna believed it did not. Prost believed it was irrelevant because he had already won. But what mattered was not the legal interpretation of an informal deal. What mattered was that from that moment forward, neither man trusted the other. Not as a teammate, not as a competitor, not as a person sharing the same garage, the same motorhome facilities, the same Honda engines that were the best in the paddock, and the reason both of them had any real chance at the championship that year. The 1989 season was McLaren against the world, and within that, Senna against Prost. The McLaren MP 4/5 with its Honda 510 engine was in a different category from everything else on the grid. Prost and Senna between them won 15 of the 16 races that year. The only victory that went elsewhere was the one at Suzuka, awarded to Alessandro Nannini of Benetton, under circumstances that will become clear very shortly. But the dominance of the car made the rivalry between the two drivers inside it all the more intense, all the more personal, all the more impossible to contain. You cannot put two people of that caliber inside the same structure and expect peace. What you get instead is exactly what Formula One got in 1989. You get Estoril in Portugal, where Senna, at full racing speed, moved his car towards Prost on the straight in a maneuver that several witnesses described as genuinely dangerous. You get a paddock that began to divide into camps. You get engineers who stopped sharing information. You get a team principal named Ron Dennis, who spent more energy that year managing the relationship between his two drivers than managing the relationship between his cars and the track. and you get, eventually, Suzuka, the place where it always ended. Heading into Japan, Prost led the championship by 16 points. In the scoring system of 1989, where only the best 11 results counted from a calendar of 16 races, this meant that Senna needed to win in Japan and in the final race in Australia just to have any mathematical chance of taking the title. There was no margin. There was no plan B. There was only win and win again, and hope that someone somewhere made a decision in his favor somewhere along the line. This was the position Senna was in when he flew to Japan. Prost, by contrast, needed only to avoid catastrophe. A finish, almost any finish, would likely be enough. A podium was comfortable. A victory was unnecessary. The arithmetic was entirely in the Frenchman's favor, and Prost understood arithmetic better than almost anyone who had ever sat in a Formula One car. This was not a coincidence. It was the man's entire method. Alain Prost had been called the Professor for years by the time they arrived at Suzuka in October of 1989. The nickname was earned through a decade of racing that valued calculation over heroism, consistency over spectacle, and long-term planning over short-term glory. He was not the fastest driver on a single lap in qualifying. In 1989, Senna had taken pole position 13 times in 16 races. Prost's best qualifying was often 3, 4, 5 tenths behind his teammate. But Prost finished races. He finished them in the points. He finished them when others retired. He managed his tires. He managed his fuel. He managed his engineers, his team, his reputation, his image, and whenever possible, his opponent. He was, in the most complete sense of the term, a professional. And professionals in any field make contingency plans. They make them quietly, ahead of time, and they do not announce them in press conferences. 2 days before the Japanese Grand Prix, at a dinner that was not publicized and was attended only by members of his inner circle, Prost had a conversation with his race engineer about the following Sunday. What was said at that dinner has been reconstructed over the years through the accounts of people who were present, through interviews given in the years that followed, and through Prost's own statements made with the distance of time and the clarity that comes when a man no longer has anything to protect or prove. The conversation was not complicated. It was, in fact, very simple. Prost told his engineer that there was only one place at Suzuka where Senna could realistically make a move for the lead. One place, the chicane after the 130R. It was the slowest part of the circuit. It was where the downforce advantage of Senna's higher drag setup would matter most. It was the place where, in a straight fight, Senna had the edge. Prost knew this. His engineer knew this. Everyone in the McLaren garage who understood the data knew this. And Prost said something that night that changed how that engineer prepared for the race, changed how the team thought about the Sunday, and changed, in a very real sense, the history of Formula One. He said, in effect, that if Senna arrived at that chicane with his wheels alongside, he was not going to move. Not this time. Not after Portugal. Not after Imola. Not after 2 years of making space for a man who never made space for anyone. The door, he said, would be closed. Whatever happened after that would be Senna's responsibility. This was not a decision made in anger. That is the most important thing to understand about Alain Prost. He was not an angry man on the racetrack. He was a cold one. There is a difference, and the difference matters enormously when you are considering what he did on lap 46 at Suzuka. Anger is reactive. Anger is unpredictable. Anger makes mistakes. What Prost brought to that corner on the 22nd of October was not anger. It was resolution. He had made a decision in advance, in a calm room, after careful thought, and he executed it exactly as planned when the moment arrived. This is, in its own way, more disturbing than anything Senna did in the cockpit that year, because it means the championship was not decided at the chicane. It was decided 2 nights earlier, over dinner, by a man who had done the math and found the one move that the math supported. The race itself unfolded exactly as the math suggested it would. Prost had removed the gurney flap from his rear wing before the start, reducing his drag and improving his straight-line speed, a modification made without telling Senna, as was later confirmed by journalist Maurice Hamilton, who had access to the McLaren garage that weekend. This was not against the rules. Teams were not obligated to share setup information between drivers, but it was a statement of intent. Prost was not going to Australia. He was going to end it here, in Japan, 1 race early, with or without the cooperation of his teammate. He took the lead at the start when Senna's launch was slow. He managed the gap through the middle of the race with the patience of a man who knew exactly how long he needed to hold on. Senna caught him on lap 40, and for the following 6 laps, the gap between the 2 McLarens stayed at around 1 second. Senna was faster in the corners. Prost was faster on the straights. There was nowhere to pass, except one place. And at that place, Prost had already made his decision. On lap 46, Senna made his move. He came from further back than most drivers would have attempted, committing early, trusting that his car's grip under braking would bring him through. He had his front wheels alongside Prost's cockpit. In most circumstances in motor racing, that is enough to constitute a claim to the corner. The car behind, having drawn alongside, has rights to the space. The car ahead is expected to leave room. This is not a written rule in every case. It is a convention. It is the unwritten agreement that makes passing possible in a sport where 2 machines moving at high speed share the same piece of asphalt. Prost had decided in advance that this convention no longer applied to him when Senna was the car coming from behind. He turned in. The cars touched. They slid together into the escape road. Both engines stopped. What followed in the next 20 minutes was Formula One operating in 2 entirely separate realities. In one reality, visible on the television broadcast that was being watched in 150 countries, Senna was gesturing frantically at the marshals, urging them to push his car, fighting to stay in the race by any means available. His car was restarted. He drove back to the pits with his damaged nose cone shedding carbon fiber onto the track. He emerged on new tires with a new front wing and chased down Alessandro Nannini's Benetton in the final 3 laps of the race to take what appeared to be a victory. He crossed the line in first place. He wept in the cockpit during his cooling down lap, tears running down his face inside the helmet, visible to the cameras that followed him around the circuit. It was an extraordinary display of determination and emotion. It was also irrelevant. The stewards disqualified him hours later. In the other reality, the one happening away from the cameras, Prost had walked calmly back to the McLaren motorhome. He did not rush. He did not check timing screens obsessively. He had understood from the moment the cars stopped that the championship was his. He knew the rules. He knew what Senna's restart from the escape road would cost. He had done the calculation in advance, just as he had done every other calculation that season. When the official disqualification came, it was not a surprise to Prost. It was a confirmation. That night, after the steward's decision had been announced, after the paddock had begun to empty, and the television trucks had started their long journey to Adelaide for the final race, Prost sat with his engineer and a small group of people from his side of the McLaren operation. What he said in that room was reported by those present in fragments, in pieces, in quotes given to journalists years later when the confidentiality of the moment had faded. He did not celebrate in the way champions usually celebrate. He was not euphoric. He was not relieved. He was, by all accounts, almost clinical in his assessment of what had happened. He acknowledged that the move had been deliberate in the sense that he had not moved out of Senna's way. He said that this was a consequence of choices Senna had made across 2 seasons, choices that had made normal racing between them impossible. And he said something that his engineer reportedly wrote down and kept, something that was quoted in at least 2 books written about the rivalry in the years that followed. He said that in racing, as in everything else, there comes a moment when the only move that protects you is the one that ends the fight entirely, and that he had made that move, and that whatever happened next in the courtrooms and the press conferences and the stewards' offices of the FIA was someone else's problem. The consequences were significant and immediate. Senna was disqualified from the Japanese Grand Prix. McLaren appealed on the grounds that a race victory had been taken from them, not on any principle about which driver was right or wrong, but because prize money and sponsorship bonuses were tied to the result. The appeal was heard in Paris. The disqualification was not only upheld, but an additional fine of 100,000 United States dollars was imposed on Senna, and a suspended ban of 6 months was handed down, with FISA labeling him officially as a dangerous driver. Jean-Marie Balestre, the president of FISA and a Frenchman, had been present in the paddock that day. Senna spent the following months publicly accusing Balestre of manipulating the outcome of the championship on behalf of Prost. The accusation was never proven in any formal proceeding, but it was never entirely dismissed either. 2 years later, Balestre was voted out of his position as president by the member nations of the governing body. His successor, Max Mosley, said in later years that Balestre had simply fixed the whole thing and that he had been outraged by it. Senna himself came back to Suzuka 12 months later with Ferrari in retreat, and Prost now wearing red instead of red and white. He came back with a score to settle and a championship to win, and a memory of the chicane that had not faded in any detail. On the first lap of the 1990 Japanese Grand Prix, he drove into Prost at the first corner at approximately 150 miles per hour. Both cars went into the gravel. Senna was champion. He admitted 2 years after that it had been deliberate. He said it was payback for 1989. He said he had learned from the best. What Donington Park in 1993 taught the world about the limits of data, Suzuka in 1989 taught about the limits of rules. Rules in Formula One, as in most competitive human activities, are written for situations that the people writing them could imagine. They do not cover every situation. They do not cover what happens when 2 people of equivalent intelligence, equivalent determination, and equivalent willingness to go to the edge of what is acceptable arrive at the same corner with the championship between them and nothing left to lose. In that situation, the rules become the floor, not the ceiling, and the question becomes not what is permitted, but what a person is willing to do when no one can stop them and the only consequence is that they win. Prost answered that question on lap 46 at Suzuka. He answered it quietly, without drama, without celebration, and with the calm certainty of a man who had already decided 2 nights earlier in a room that no camera ever entered. He answered it the way he answered every question in his career, with math, with patience, and with the knowledge that the most devastating move in any rivalry is not the fastest one. It is the one that was planned before the race began, executed without hesitation, and understood by everyone only after it was already over. The 1989 World Championship was declared for Alain Prost. He won it with 61 points to Senna's 60. A margin of 1 point. The thinnest margin the sport had seen in years. And yet, in the most meaningful sense, the championship was not decided by a point. It was decided by a dinner, by a conversation, by a decision made in the quiet before the storm. It was decided by what Prost told his engineer that night. And Formula One has never quite looked at a closed door the same way since.